a series of conference sessions that are going to lead up to our in-person conference in South Bend, September 28th through October 1st of 2021. So we won't be meeting in person this year, but hopefully next year we'll be able to do that. I want to welcome the Hoosiers, who usually come next year in some beautiful locations and historic buildings in South Bend. For those new to the Preserving Historic Places Preservation Conference, we hope that this series gives you a taste of the kinds of sessions that we host at the in-person conference. I may be a little biased, but I think we have the best conference, the best speakers, and the best attendees. So maybe if you've not been to one, this will motivate you to come visit us in South Bend. I want to thank my co-administrators of the conference and these virtual lectures, Jessica Kramer, who's in the background here on this meeting, and Suzanne Stannis, both from Indiana Landmarks, and because without their help, none of this will be possible. We will be having polls during this just to make sure you're paying attention. And so the first one is going to be now. And so while I am reading off some of our sponsors, you can do a poll and tell us where you are from. The conference and our virtual sessions are not possible without our support of the Division of Historic Preservation and Archaeology, Indiana Landmarks, Indiana University, St. Joseph County Commissioners, RC Engineering, the City of South Bend, the Cornelius O'Brien Lecture Series, the Indiana Housing and Community Development Authority, Marvin Windows, the National Park Service, Wis Janey Elsner Associates, Visit South Bend, Mishawaka. And then we've got some supporters, Burlung Cultural Resources Analysis, Historic Preservation and Heritage and Consulting, the Indiana Archaeology Council, Old National Bank, Ratio Architects, and Ari Diamond and Associates. Now, if it weren't for all those sponsors, this thing could not be free. Our conference could not be as cheap as it is when you go in person. So that's pretty impressive. So look, 77% of you are from Indiana. We like that. 11% from the Midwest, because we're going to talk about how important the Midwest is, and then 12% from outside the United States, or outside of the U.S., elsewhere in the United States, but no one from outside, so that's very sad, but that's okay. All right. Whether you're at your office or on your couch, just a little clap to thank our supporters for all that they do. Please save the date of July 30th. It's our next virtual session. Russ Carnahan of the National Grassroots Lobbying Organization Preservation Action will provide updates on preservation legislation topics in Congress as it heads back to their districts for the August recess. I think this one could be interesting. Now we are using the webinar version of Zoom today, so attendees, your microphones are already muted. So eat your lunch, walk around, whatever you want to do, and your video is also hidden, so don't worry about that. So you're not going to be able to ask your questions the normal way you do in a Zoom meeting. You're going to submit your questions at the bottom using the Q&A feature, and then I'll be moderating them and asking the question to the panelists as time allows. This session is being recorded and will be available shortly after the presentation. We'll also be sending to everyone who registered in the next day or so a document with links to help you learn more about the conference, the next virtual session, and other mid-century modern resources. So be looking for that in your email. And so now on to our speakers. These are two of my favorite archivists in the state. Maire Gurevitz is a graduate of Butler University, and she received her MA in Public History and Library Science from Indiana University, Purdue University at Indianapolis. She's been employed as an archivist at the Indiana Historical Society for 10 years, and she specializes in large processing projects, such as the Irwin-Sweeney-Miller Family Collection, which she's going to talk about today, the Madam C.J. Walker Collection, and the Wide Press Collection. We also have Jordan Ryan, who got her master's degree in public history, also from IUPUI, and a bachelor's degree in art and history from Heron School of Art. Jordan serves as the architectural archivist and curator of the Indianapolis Bicentennial Project at the Indiana Historical Society. Their scholarship revolves around the urban built environment and development, the history of redlining, urban highway displacement, hostile architecture, and LGBTQ historic sites. And in their free time, Jordan enjoys restoring an 1867 workers' cottage in Fountain Square. So I turn it over to you ladies to do a little bit.
Jeannie. Let me get this going here. Okay, so welcome everyone to the Mod Squad. Jordan and I are gonna be sharing some cool images and talking about mid-century modern collections from our library at the Indiana Historical Society today. So I'm going first, and I'm focusing on the Irwin-Sweeney-Miller family from Columbus, Indiana, and talking about Midwesternist, modern architecture, and the family. So here's 4 things that I sort of want to focus on today. First, what is Midwesternist? First of all, is this even a word? No one knows, not sure, but for our purposes, it's a word today. And next, I want to introduce you all to the Irwin-Sweeney-Millers and spend some time looking at the genesis of the first modern building the family brought to Columbus, which is First Christian Church. And then I'm going to focus a little bit on Ervin Miller and what happened once he took the reins from his great uncle and the Cummins Engine Foundation and the architecture program. And finally, I want to show you some more image highlights from the collection, focus more on family relationships with well-known modernist architects, artists, and designers. So I'm going to be kind of referring to these 3 quotations as we go along. This first one is more about style. And then the second one I'm going to keep coming back to is about the Midwest being home. And the third one is about, you know, hallmarks of the Midwest, of inventing, scrapping the old, inventing, and installing the new, which I sort of feel like goes along with the Columbus story. So let's meet the Irwin-Sweeney-Miller family. So the family's footprint in Columbus was started by Joseph Ireland Irwin, who started Irwin's Bank, as well as an interurban company and some other businesses. And he is also the one who built the family home at 608 5th Street in Columbus, which housed the entire family over 4 generations. And so Irwin's son, William Glanton Irwin, who is this guy here and this guy here, expanded his father's business interests in stockholding. So in addition to overseeing the businesses his father started, he invested in things like apple orchards, oil, meat packing, starch and refining, a chain of grocery stores, and most notably, he supported Plessy Cummins in his development of diesel engines, which eventually became Cummins Engine Company. And this Cummins Engine Company plays an important role in Columbus then and still today. So there's also William Glanton Irwin's sister, Linnie, and her daughter, Nettie, and sister, Elsie, Nettie's husband, Hugh, and then the next generation is Ervin Miller and his sister, Clementine, who you'll see on the next slide. So this whole family lived together, and they sat on boards of their businesses and philanthropies. So they made a lot of decisions together. And since William Irwin never married or had any children of his own, he was very active with his grandnephew Irwin and grandniece Clementine's lives. And another important thing to note is that although the family traveled extensively all over the world and had business and philanthropic interests worldwide as well, Columbus was always their home base, and they invested in it as such. And so this kind of goes back to that second quote of Midwesterners making their home the best place they can make it. So what do we think of when we imagine a church? Another thing to know about this family is that they were very devout Christians. Linnie's husband, Zachary Taylor Sweeney, was the pastor of Tabernacle Christian Church, the congregation of which would eventually become First Christian Church. The funds for this new church building came mostly from personal funds from the Irwin-Sweeney-Miller family, as well as from the Christian Foundation, which was their charitable giving arm. So when they initially decided to build this new church, they had plans approved, they had an architect hired to make a very traditional church building, sort of like the one pictured here, except probably like, you know, smaller. But the architect got sick and could not execute the project. So here's where it gets interesting. So I happened to find this, see this meme while I was putting this presentation together, and I thought it was funny and appropriate because what it's saying here is sort of the story of how the Saarinen got involved with Columbus and with the family. So you know how it's like 7 Kevin Bacon degrees of separation here in the Midwest. And it was William Glenn Irwin's nephew, Ervin Miller, who, after taking an architecture appreciation class at Yale, suggested that the family consider ditching a traditional church design for a more modern one. And then according to his aunt, or Elsie's, recollections, it was Nettie Miller, Irwin's mother, who suggested Ariel Saarinen as the man for the job. And why is this? Because of this meme. Nettie knew someone who knew someone. So Saarinen came recommended by a woman in Nettie's Sunday school class, whose son was married to the daughter of Saarinen's contractor, A.C. And it was Nettie who, as a member of the...
Mary, I'm going to stop you for a second. You are cutting out. You're cutting out. Like, we can't hear you very well.
Can you, is this better?
Yeah.
Okay.
You just started to drop off. So go back to the Sunday school lady.
I gotcha. So Saarinen came recommended by a woman in Nettie's Sunday school class whose son was married to the daughter of Saarinen's contractor, A.C. And so it was Nettie who, as a member of the church building committee, went to Detroit to interview Saarinen for the job. Okay, so Irwins, Millers, and Saarinens. So mother and son and daughter Clementine enters the mix on being on board with the new direction of this church project. So Hugh Miller and the uncle, William Irwin, are kind of wary about it. They're not sure about the cost, they're not sure about the design, they're really not sure about the time frame that this is going to get completed in. But all the while, the kids, Irwin and Clementine, are at home reporting back to their mother, who's at the family home in Canada for the summer, trying to give direction and soothe the ruffled feathers of Uncle Will Irwin. In one letter to her mother, Clementine says, "I can see trouble brewing on the church horizon." She continues to report that Mr. S., Mr. Saarinen, says he wishes mother were here to handle Uncle William G. Irwin. The next summer in 1941, Nettie writes to Clementine, again from Muskoka, Canada, addressing continued concerns over the church. But she says, the church will be all right though. Ariel Saarinen's forte is functional architecture, and he will make that just right. And further on in the letter, she comments that she is relieved that the family members in Columbus seem pleased with the way the construction is shaping up. She says, "I'm so delighted to know that you are pleased with the church since the scaffolding has been taken down. Your father was very doubtful about that. He did not know whether he was going to like it or not." So with this church design, I think the family's Midwesternness is showing, as their attraction to the design is because it's functional, simple, and unadorned, much like our flat cornfield and pastoral surroundings. So here, I'm excited to show everyone we received a grant from LSTA to digitize films in our collection. And with that, we had about 34 films from the Miller collection that were sort of labeled, but we just didn't really know what was on them and didn't have the means to see. And so they have all been digitized, and you can see them on our YouTube page or on our digital image collection page. So I'm going to share one that has a little clip of Lenny Sweeney in the greenhouse at the 608 Irwin House in Columbus, and then it pans to the church construction in Columbus. So hopefully this helps. So we've got Mama with her orchids, and then it will go on to the church construction. We have a variety of videos or films from the collection showing international sites around Columbus and the family in Canada. So here's the church under construction in Columbus. And here's some still images of the church from our collections at the Historical Society. The church was completed in 1942. There's sort of a lot of local lore about how the relationship between Ariel and Jim was started during this time. But the fact remains that the two would have interacted and known each other during this time. We just, I don't know, did they go have sodas at Zaharako's? Not sure, can't say for sure. But this is definitely, they did meet each other here, and this was a relationship that continued on, as we will see. And also, Ariel Saarinen was one of the first people that Ervin Miller reached out to when he was starting to get involved in community development in There's another view of the church, which I like because of the street signs here. And this is from an architecture review of the church in the Indy Star, which I pulled because it goes along with that first quote I sort of referenced at the beginning of the presentation about regularity, simplicity, plain lines, linearity, that sort of thing. So now we're going to sort of shift to the family's full buy-in with modernism. So the church was sort of their first venture, and now they're going to go full in on this. I also like this quote, spell it and let the other guy pronounce. I saw it somewhere in the Miller family collection, and I also like it because it feels like a thing your Midwestern grandpa might say. But it's also how Ervin Miller was running things in Columbus. He sort of proffered the suggestions and ideas and stepped in when he had to, but mostly just hired folks to help him who were ready to execute the plans. So let's talk a little bit more about J. Ervin Miller. Sometimes I'll slip up and say Jim instead of Ervin Miller because the family notated most things in their 3 initials, so I'm just used to saying Jim. But anyhow, so we've referenced him a few times so far, and he's the one that was the initial modern enthusiast. And I think this, there's this excerpt that I put up here from his journal that he was keeping in the first few years when he was sort of thrust into the family business, first at the grocery stores and then at Cummins. And so it's interesting, first of all, because if you come to do research in our collection, you can see how his handwriting is the worst. And I've been looking at it for 10 years and it still doesn't get better. But second of all, I think it is really Midwestern humble, what he's writing in this entry, and then also sort of prophetic. So I'll sort of read you this entry. He says, as to the prestige, etc., part of it, the only thing I can do at the present is to ignore it, however pleasant it would be to possess it, and to take the attitude that I intend to do any job as well as I can, using any, and that I mean, means I can, whether it involves loss or gain of prestige or what. I'm not able yet to pitch myself into this job, to see things to be done, or to arrive at decisions that should be easy ones. I'm very lazy, I watch the clock, I'm not good at finding things to do. If I am writing and continue to write in this book for any reason at all, it is for this, that someday I may, by some long chance, and in spite of considerable self-esteem, I am forced to admit is a long chance, achieve enough fame so that when dead, I may be pointed to as a fine and famous man, and then that I may leave this book behind as evidence of what I have long suspected to be the truth, that men whom the world calls great were not all model boys, gigantic intellects, or tireless and intense workers. So Jim has this tutelage from his uncle, William Irwin, and I think he really grows in confidence from this time when he's writing the entry to when he's serving in the military during World War II. And then suddenly in 1943, William Irwin dies. And the family is left reeling because he's the one that has been controlling all the businesses and finances. And Jim applies to leave the service and come home to sort out all of the family businesses and philanthropy and all that. And so I like to think about this time, how daunting this must have been, especially while he's grieving the loss of his uncle. But I think that this is also the time when he begins to fully commit to his role at the helm of the family, and therefore commits fully to Columbus. And when he makes his commitment, he has an eye to the future. So this is the situation that he finds himself in post-World War II Columbus. More than double population growth, schools over capacity, and the community knows that some things got to give and major public improvements have to be made. But all of these capital improvements and new schools cost money, taxpayer money. And what do we love to grumble about here? Taxes. So Jim, along with other community leaders, goes on a major PR and community cheerleading campaign to raise funds to get this done. So this quote that I have up here comes from an editorial he publishes in the newspaper in a series that's called The Columbus of Tomorrow. Basically, he's just saying, let's suck it up now, do it right, and it will pay off for us in the long run. So this is another excerpt from one of his community cheerleader speeches that he's giving in the 50s. And this time it's to the Columbus Women's Club. So Ervin Miller is famous for saying something along the lines of mediocrity is expensive. And we have hundreds and hundreds of pages of his speeches in our collection. And this theme comes up countless times in business, in architecture, in everything. So it's that good, solid things don't really come cheap. And that the best, and that doing the very best you can to get something right the first time is worth it. And that's a central theme that he continues to repeat throughout most of his life. And so what comes about these meetings and community discussions is this proposal from the Cummins Engine Foundation to work with the community. The Cummins Engine Foundation agrees to pay the architect fees for an architect for public buildings. So these are mostly schools. It ends up being 14 schools and 5 public buildings. And then the foundation does separately invest in the public library, a golf course, and a public park. So the schools or public buildings would get a list of 5 architects to choose from, and these were all very prominent modernist architects, and then they would pay the fees, and it would be about 10% of the project. So in short, reducing the taxpayer burden. And then, so it's from this proposal that we now have all of these modernist buildings in the city of Columbus. So I also feel like this goes back to my first quote about things being simple, and the third quote about scrapping the old and inventing the new. So for Miller, this is a good business decision and a good decision as a steward of the community. So interestingly enough, there's an article from the Architectural Forum in 1974, and the title is "Why Do So Many Architects Like J. Ervin Miller?" And it says that Ervin Miller is not attracted by visual imagery, and in fact shies away from architects who start by talking in terms of how the building will look. Miller desires, first of all, a thorough comprehension of the problem. Rather than having architects flaunt their oeuvre, he prefers their exhibiting a keen insight into his needs. So when we think of Columbus, or at least when I think of it, everything that first comes to mind is the visual imagery of the modernist buildings there. And alternately, Ervin Miller's was whatever works best for this community and is going to be done right. So it should also be noted that not everyone in the community was on this Ervin Miller modernist architecture train. And it's okay, we're all entitled to our opinions. But I'm going to put it out there that my bias is that I'm fully on the J. Ervin Miller train. I'm his biggest fan. And, but the arguments that were made against the architecture program were that the high design architects were too radical, too against the grain of Midwestern simplicity, and also that the costs were too much, even with the Cummins Engine Foundation picking up the bill for architect fees. So also I will say that he did put his money where his mouth is and did personally invest in modern architecture outside of the Cummins Engine Foundation. So Irwin Union Bank branches, North Christian Church, and his personal residence, the famous Miller House, and also his summer home in Muskoka, Canada. Both of these residences, which were done by his friend Eero Saarinen. So we've seen a smattering of photos and a film from the collection so far. And so this is my disclaimer. Our archive is not heavy on blueprints or plans. So for that, you have to go see my friend Trisha Gilson at the Columbus, Indiana Architectural Archives. She has amazing plans and blueprints for buildings all over the city of Columbus there. And if you are interested in the minutia and fabric swatches and correspondence and plans relating directly to the Miller house and garden, you go see Lydia Spots over at Newfields, or a lot of the Miller House collection has been digitized. So you can access all of the correspondence and plans and things like that through the archives at Newfields. It's an amazing, incredible resource. I use it all the time. I like to look through it, especially, you know, if I'm bored and find some new fun letters between the Millers and the Saarinens and the Gerards. But everything else that has to do with the family lives with us at the Historical Society. And we house archives for each member of the 4-generation family. Irwin Miller and Xenia Miller's papers probably get the most use, but the sister, Clementine, also shared her brother and sister-in-law's tastes in architecture and design. And she was also that sort of like spy on the ground when First Christian Church was happening. So I would love to see some more research projects using her papers, because she also had personal relationships with a lot of these architects and designers, and hired them for various projects that she was involved in herself. And I also have research project ideas for other family members, but we're here to talk about modernism, so I'll say that for another day. But you can contact me if you want to talk. So without further ado, here's some more images and some of my favorite things that are modern in the collection. So I love all the things that are sort of personal relationships. I found this photo recently here of Harry Weiss and his wife Kitty visiting the Millers up in Canada. So Harry Weiss actually designed Clementine Miller Tangeman's residence there in Muskoka. But he was, again, personal friends with the family, so he and his wife would come up to hang out. And then also on the other side is Xenia and Alexander and Susan Girard. And this was when the Millers were out visiting the Girard family in New Mexico. And this must have been Ervin Miller taking a photo of the foursome while they were having breakfast. So I have a special image here for my friend Jordan, because Evans Wolin visited the Miller house here, as we can see, on a page from their guest book. So I put that in there especially for her, but you can also see the Girards were there. Another thing that's fun in the collection is that Ervin Miller was kind of a cartoonist, and his little cartoons, you can see at the bottom of the page there, are spotted all over his papers. And then also there's this letter from Harry Weiss writing to Xenia Miller about some design things, and then also, some family news. These are some really fun drawings from Jean Fungley. First, on the left is a drawing that he left in the guest book for Miller House, which Chaos is the kinetic sculpture that can be found at the Commons building, downtown Columbus. And then the image on the right is just a casual Christmas card that he sent to the Millers, which is just really kind of fun, crazy design. This is on the left here. I believe it is a potential mock-up for the offices at 301 Washington Street, but I'm not entirely sure. The image at the left is just sort of a detail image of some of the little statues and trinket kind of things that Alexander Girard sourced for Mrs. Miller that are sort of all over the house. And then here, the photo on the left is sort of this classic image of Xenia Miller with Alexander Girard in his studio looking over plans, what I'm assuming were plans for Miller House. And then on the right here is just a nice photo of Xenia outside the house enjoying breakfast. And I believe the kimono that she was wearing, Ervin Miller also used to use Alexander Girard to source Christmas presents for his wife. And there is a letter in the archives at the IMA about a kimono that Girard sent along for him to give to Xenia for Christmas. And so I kind of wonder if maybe that is the kimono in question. So these are just a few of the images that are in our collection. There's also great ruminations on architecture and art from a variety of family members. There is also detailed correspondence showing, if you're interested in city planning, what was happening with the city of Columbus in the crucial post-World War II growth period that brought about the Columbus that we know today. So please, let's continue the conversation. Happy to take some questions, and please reach out if you want to talk about doing research on the collection here.
And just so everyone knows, when we send out that document afterwards, probably tomorrow, Mary sent a bunch of links. So there's a link to the YouTube videos and things like that. Several people commented how they were wonderful pieces of history to uncover and stuff like that. So those are going to be available to people to look at stuff. So while we switch from Mary to Jordan on the PowerPoints, I'm going to release the next poll, kind of like releasing the Kraken. And let's see, release that. All right, have you visited Columbus or not? And then if you have any questions, make sure you put them in the Q&A at the bottom, and then I'll look at that. There's one that says, was the Irwin Library at Butler built using the same model of design and funding?
Yes, so the family invested heavily in Butler University because the father, Hugh Miller, and also Nettie Miller went to Butler, and so they invested heavily in the School of Religion there, and also sat on the board of directors for the university for many years, and gave a personal donation, I believe, to get that library built, as well as other, they're responsible for the buildings at Christian Theological Seminary, which is now part of Butler again, sort of. But that was another family investment in modern architecture in Indianapolis.
All right. So Jordan, you're ready. If you want to go ahead and get yourself over there. Someone said they came in a little late and wanted to know what the architecture's features were in the film. So if you could just quickly, while Jordan's getting her PowerPoint up.
Sure. Yeah, the film was just showing sort of a broad pan over construction of First Christian Church in Columbus.
All right.
How's my sound, Jeannie? Am I coming in okay?
Yeah, I hear you.
All right, great. Thanks everyone for joining us today, especially to Jeannie and Suzanne and Jessica for planning this event, and to my colleague Mary. So I want to start by saying that all images that I'm using are from the Indiana Historical Society unless noted on the slide, and it would be wrong of me not to note that I have altered a few images, particularly renderings, with higher contrast so that it's easier for you all to see while viewing on slides. So here's just an outline of what I'm going to talk about today. So I'm going to focus on two excellent mid-century modern collections we have in the archive, and a little bit about how to use them, and sort of wrap it up and talk about how they'll be used in the future and what different preservation and architectural groups are doing with these materials. So first I want to talk about Evans Woollen, who I would argue is one of the most foremost modern architects of Indiana and Indianapolis. So this is Evans in front of Cluse Hall. He was born in Indianapolis in 1927, and he went to study architecture at Yale University. He worked for and under Philip Johnson, who some of you know as the Glass House architect. Here's reference to the Glass House. And so Wolin returned to Indianapolis in 1955 to establish his own firm, and he worked predominantly at the beginning on mid-century modern residential projects. After that, you see an exploration into brutalism in the 1960s and 70s, and sort of an embracing postmodernism and getting into more contemporary architecture, absolutely, as his firm expanded to Woollen, Molzan and Partners in 1982. And that's where you see really an explosion of types of structures they're working with: libraries, schools, museums, churches. You know, it's not just residential work. The firm dissolved in 2011, and Wolin died in May of 2016, but many of his principles still practice in the Indianapolis area. So I'm actually going to go forward in time a little bit in his portfolio and talk about some of his most well-known works, just to sort of orient you to his projects. So that really looks at both his brutalist works and his postmodernist works. So I know that a lot of you have different backgrounds, and some of you may know this, but for those of you who are sort of new to these terms, just to give you some definitions, brutalism is usually associated with raw or exposed concrete structures. They typically are unadorned, which is an extreme reaction to Victorian styled ornamentation. Some people might say they're a bit cold. You tend to see them in a lot of 1960s and 70s government and institutional buildings. And then postmodernism has more to do with sort of referencing former architectural styles. It tends to be very sculptural, playing with forms, playing with shapes. So keep those in mind as we go over the next few examples of his work. So his earlier work really consisted of both mid-century modern residences, and then after he established himself, really diving into brutalism. So some of his most well-known works include Barton Towers, which is here in 1968 in downtown Indianapolis. This is probably one of his most polarizing buildings. You either love it or you hate it. The tower is on the right, and then on the left you can see the former strip of apartment units that actually were over East Street at one time, connecting to a second tower that was later built. Another example just a few years before is Cluse Hall, which I think probably has more of a positive reaction from a lot of people. I do want to note that he collaborated on this with architect John Johansson. This is also still standing, and just a beautiful sort of play of shapes and sort of columns and concrete. And another example, a little bit later, completed in 1976, is the Minton Capehart Federal Building, which is also in downtown Indianapolis along Pennsylvania Street. So this one is still standing. It has the pretty famous Milton Glaser mural that some of you may know, and Glaser just recently passed away, but his mural was restored maybe 8 years ago. So after we get through sort of his brutalist phase, he starts to play with postmodernism, particularly in the firm. And this was my favorite example to show. This is White River Gardens, which was completed in 1999. You know, he's sort of going from a very controversial style to this more welcoming and playful style. I think about the garden. The greenhouse area definitely seems kind of like a greenhouse on steroids, and then you have sort of this like conical and rectangular shapes in front. But he did other sorts of contemporary and postmodern structures like this. A lot of it's in Indianapolis, both museums, libraries, churches. I want to point out the Children's Museum in Indianapolis is one of those editions. Also, he did the Christ Church Cathedral edition off the circle. So these works tend to be, you know, more playful. They're sort of referencing both massing, but also geometry. If you look at sort of the form and even some of the window decisions. So now that you sort of have a better idea of his more famous works, I want to actually go back in time and talk about his mid-century modern residential work, which is where he actually started his career when he left Yale. So for those of you who maybe aren't sure, mid-century modern architecture tends to be looking at late 40s, early 50s, clean, unadorned, you know, open spaces. Some of these residential works will have a relationship with nature, lots of windows, post and beam construction is what you start to see more and more of, and sometimes a play with natural materials. So sort of keep that in mind as we go through his residential works. So the first one This isn't in Indiana, this is actually in Connecticut. It's the art residence in 1955. So this would have been the year he finished Yale and the year he actually moves to Indianapolis to establish his firm. So I wonder if this is his first commission. And, you know, it sort of has a glass house feel to it as well. And, you know, it definitely has some, it feels expansive. It's sort of got that indoor-outdoor play with the glass, playing with nature. And then you see this trend repeated in many homes that he designed in Indianapolis. So one of the earliest ones we have in the collection is the Park Residence, which was completed in 1958. This is in the Devonshire neighborhood. I'm sure some of you recognize it. So if we're thinking about sort of playing with landscape with your form, is it possible that maybe Wolin was thinking about the tree canopy and kind of going up, you know, building up with this sort of two-story glass house feeling? That's sort of the feeling I'm getting from this. Being situated in a suburban area in a wooded forest, it makes sense to build up and have that sort of grand space. Another example, a couple years later, is the Thurston Residence. Again, it definitely has a similar vibe to the glass house. This is also in the Devonshire neighborhood and very much situated in a wooded area. I think this is the one that it was added onto, and it was recently on Indiana Landmarks tour. But that area with the balconies and the bedrooms is still intact. And a very interesting example is the Marx Residence, which is in the Meridian Hills, William Creek neighborhood. So this is a bit larger of a home compared to the other structures, but it's showing sort of this mid-century modern design meets suburbia. You know, you have a very large lawn, you have a longer, wider house, because, you know, density and it's not really an issue in suburbia. You know, you want that space. So seeing how he's expanding his style on the landscape is really interesting. In the bottom corner, you can see an interior shot of the house. This is a great room, and I really like this ceiling. This application he's done to the ceiling is really interesting, and you see the fenestration choices. I don't know if he had planned this, but it's a lot of windows sort of grouped in threes. And you see that with other modern home design as well. So he's, you know, sort of taking that high style modern, and it's a little bit more suburbia in this example. So I'm a big nerd, and I map out every location of every structure noted in my architectural collections. And I do this because it's helpful for researchers and for me to get back to this information when I have a question come in. So I always try to map out every property mentioned, and then I code them based on if they're demolished or still standing or, you know, significantly altered. So for the Woollen, Molzan, and Partners collection, there are just over 160 projects included in this collection. It's about 3,000 architectural drawings and over 10,000 photographs, negatives, and slides documenting all phases of construction of these projects, from the models, site demolition and prep work to completion. There's some articles, press clippings, magazines, newspapers, things like that, and some oral histories in the collection as well. So for this collection, you know, if you're not sure if you maybe live in a Wolin home and you want to know, you can certainly ask me, because I can just refer to this this spreadsheet and this map and let you know what I've got on a particular property. And then most of his works are still standing, which is interesting because most of my architectural collections that I've archived, about, you know, anywhere from 30 to 50% of the properties have been demolished. So that was an interesting note when I did this collection. So now I'm going to switch gears and talk about another really great modern architecture collection we have, and that is the papers of Avriel Shull. And I think we can all agree that she really broke the local glass ceiling when it comes to the boys' club that had been architecture at the time. She was a self-taught architectural designer and builder and interior decorator. And she was born in Hamilton County in 1933, attended Carmel High School, and took classes at both Butler University and the John Herron School of Art. She actually started her career as a commercial artist, but transitioned into architectural design and building in 1953, in many ways breaking the glass ceiling, which is one of the reasons we did include her in our Be Heard Women's exhibit we had up earlier this year. And although this collection was processed many years before I came to the archive, I spent a decent amount of time sort of going through and doing my own discovery while curating her component of the Be Heard exhibit. So all the materials I'll be showing you today are things that I worked with for that exhibit. I think a lot of us know Shull for her work on the Thornhurst subdivision. That's probably her most popular space, but she did also design residences in Spring Mill Estates and Williams Creek Heights, Somerset Hills, Devon Woods, Meridian Hills, and a few other places. She did design a few apartment buildings and some commercial structures as well. And I think we can all agree, every time a real estate listing pops up on one of her buildings, it's really just a testament to her genius, how popular her places have lived on. She did die early at the age of 45 in 1976, but she was just a few years younger than Evans, and at the time, they both were working in the city doing modern architecture, so it's interesting to see sort of how their timelines intersect and if they possibly knew each other or were inspired by each other. So a few of my favorite images from this collection. First, I have a conversation pit concept to show you from 1955. Again, I have altered the contrast a little bit on this image just to make it more readable on the screen. So we don't know a lot about this rendering. There wasn't any context with it, but I question, was she inspired by the Miller House conversation pit? We know that that was designed probably 1952, 53, and if this was done in 55, was she talking to architects and was she going to Columbus? We don't know, but it's interesting to think about how ideas sort of spread and are sort of shape the design on a regional, local level. This is one of my favorite sort of color pencil renderings from the collection. So this is actually a living room concept for Miami. And it's interesting because it was for a trailer park subdivision that was going in Miami, and it still exists. It's very much, most of the original structures are there. I have not yet been able to identify which structure this concept might have been connected to, but she was working not just in sort of the local county or city level, but she had connections to Miami, and you see that with other architects in our collection. You see that a lot with Rubish and Hunter, sort of building the first wave of Miami Beach. So that was interesting that even decades later, we have architects in our collection that are working in Miami. These are unidentified renderings, but I use them as sort of a teaching tool when I'm talking about Shull, just to show the contrast and range of her exterior sort of style and treatment. So the top you can see is sort of your high style mid-century modern home. You probably have a carport or a garage on the left. That middle area is probably the great room, living room, dining room, very open common area. And then on the right is probably your bedroom wing. On the bottom is, I think, a much more accessible illustration when you're thinking about modern suburbia. I think a lot of us have been in a house like this, or maybe even grew up in a house like this. You have the garage sort of focused at the center by the entrance. You have a walkout basement. So this is just to sort of show that she definitely could do sort of the spectrum of modern residential design. And then of course, we have a great deal of documentation and correspondence in the collection as well. And this is a Surveyor plat from the Thornhurst edition, which is arguably her most popular effort. So this shows sort of the subdivision planning for all of the houses built in this area between 1957 and 1971. So sort of going along with that, thinking about the specs of the collection, you know, it is predominantly business records, things like contracts and permits and client files, you know, things like these surveyor plats, also correspondence, even up until the month of her death. We have letters that she was writing, working on different projects. And then we do have a lot of architectural drawings and sketches, both concepts and technical drawings for her projects, and a little bit of printed material, mostly magazines, and some sort of, you know, obituaries and things related to her death. So I have not done a deep dive into this collection since I didn't process it. So I haven't been able to map everything out, but just doing sort of a rough estimate, looking at the collection guide and some of the content, I think there's about 50 homes in her collection that are represented in what we have. But strangely enough, there is barely any photo documentation. So we got all of the paper records and the drawings. I don't know if photos just didn't exist. I have to think they did. I don't know where they are. If you know of a secret photo archive of her structures, please let me know, because that's one of my biggest mysteries when dealing with this collection. So sort of tying it back together, thinking about how it's possible that Woollen and Shull maybe knew each other and were maybe inspired by each other, or sort of dialed into the same kind of conversations going on in the architectural community at the time. But thinking about roundhouses, this just sort of struck me looking at both of their collections and how similar these two concepts are. On the left is the Lieben residence, which Woollen built and designed in 1964. And in the right is Shull's concept for a turtle house. So this is not built, and this was an idea 9 years later. But to take you through it, because I know it's a little hard to see, between the turtle's legs is like a carport, and then stairs up into the house or through one of the turtle's legs. And then the house is kind of a similar layout with rooms along the sides, and then a larger open space on one side and in the middle of the structure, with the dining room in the turtle's head. But I think that this is just a great sort of unbuilt concept that really reflects Shull's creative whimsy and, you know, just what could have been possible if she had lived longer, and what other kind of projects would we have seen come from her firm. So a little bit about why we collect these materials. I think for a while now, there's been a discussion about how do we protect and what do we save when it comes to mid-century modern architecture. What is historically significant and what is architecturally significant? And DHPA has done a great job at sort of framing that discussion with these guides on style and developments that I think will be really helpful as more and more single structures, but also neighborhoods, perhaps get listed on the National Register. So I have a screenshot of the Thornhurst edition survey that was done as they were working on the National Register nomination. And then I have the Indiana Modern logo, which is the affinity group for Indiana landmarks, because it's not just reference and, you know, working on these preservation projects and research, but also programs and engagement are really important. Things like this talk, things like Indiana Modern's tours, different programs and ways to sort of interpret this history and share it and highlight it will be really important as we sort of work through all of these great resources that are still out in the landscape and talking about how we restore things and what we save. And then a few final thoughts. I've included my contact info as well as the collection guide. So these are the finding aids for both collections if you're interested in looking up a property or seeing just what we have. Also, some of the Woollen collection has been digitized, so that final link you see is the link to the digital collection. And then I have a couple things listed just thinking about ways we can share and engage in this content, and that's both through tours I give through the Historical Society, but also through our programs. So definitely look for things on our calendar on our website. We usually do a program for Design Month. Sometimes we collaborate with different groups for Preservation Month, and then I try to do a talk every year for Indie Design Week when I can. So those are different ways to engage with the collections and with the archive. And certainly if you have, you know, any materials you might want to consider donating or having digitized, you know, you can always contact me and we can discuss that too. And that's all I got.
All right, sorry, I was just answering someone's question. So I got a couple of questions to, all right, so somebody asked, Jordan, the brutalist items that were Evans Woolens, were they made of limestone or concrete?
I think a lot of it is concrete, but I'm trying to think if anything was limestone. It's possible. I can, if you want to drop their contact info, I can look in the collection guide.
Okay. The map, everyone was very, very excited about the map. Very, very like, and a lot of people like, what about this house and this house? And so is it available online or do they just need to contact you directly and ask that question?
Yeah, it's not included in the collection guide and it's sort of a working document that I'm always adding to. So I can provide it if you just email me. Yeah, I can send it out or just send the map link out.
If you send the map link to me, we'll send it with the when we send out the document that's going to have a lot of these resources and things like that on there, and then people can ask more questions of you from there, so that would be great. Someone asked if they were influenced by George Fred Keck, who did the Chicago, the House of Tomorrow. Yeah,
I mean, they have to be. I don't have the smoking gun letter. I haven't seen anything that says like, I saw this work and my whole, you know, practice is going to be aligned with this now. So I haven't seen any direct connections, but I have to assume that they were all dialed into like what was going on and what was popular at the time.
All right. And then several people were asking, have you both seen Mary and Jordan, the movie Columbus? And Mary did comment in the chat room that the society used or helped that architect or director with his stuff. I didn't know if you guys have seen that movie.
Yes, we went to the premiere in Indianapolis. So.
All right. Is anybody got any we said we'd be only an hour. We're a little over, but that's okay because, you know, what else are we going to go do but go back to work? Anybody else have some last minute? I know several of you have asked, like, wanted to let Jordan know some things, so I've taken your name down and I'll let Jordan know and get your email to her. We'll put all of these links and resources. It'll go out in the next couple of days. I just need to make it look a little prettier than it is right now, and we'll get that out. But are there any last minute questions for anybody before we all go back to work? All right, I want to thank you both, Mary and Jordan, for this great piece. Hopefully everyone has participated. We'll come back again in July 30th, again, noon Eastern time. We are recording this, and so it'll be available on the Indiana Landmarks' portion of their website that deals with the conference. That'll be available there. So if people have an interest in seeing this later, that can definitely happen. And then we'll see everyone in July. So. Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks.